So a number of you will have seen many responses I've done in the past on Second Thought. This is an argument he's made against capitalism relative to do with the argument on efficiency.
If you live in what's commonly called the Western world, especially in the United States, you've no doubt heard the claim that capitalism is the most efficient system for the distribution of products.
Yes, capitalism is the most efficient system available for allocating scarce natural resources. We don't live under a capitalist system, and this is where the problem lies.
And that this is thanks to the miracle of the free market.
Well, how the hell is it free market when you've got interest rates being manipulated by a central banking system? You've got the ratio of money being manipulated. Capitalism is about the market regulating itself. It's about leaving it down to the laws of supply and demand. So when you're talking about a free market, you're essentially talking about leaving the interest rates be to the laws of supply and demand. The same goes for the ratio of money. Where's the free market money? That's right, you don't have the free market money because it was fraudulently taken from you. Imposed upon the market was a fiat currency at the time. Of course, it would eventually become the petrodollar, but the point being is the fact that you don't have free market money. So how the hell can you say you live under some sort of free market?
As I've mentioned in recent videos, American faith in the economic structure of capitalism is on the decline.
It's on the decline because there are a lot of misinformed people. That's what it's down to. A lot of people actually think they live under capitalism. That's the sad part.
The assertion that capitalism is efficient.
Well, that's rather quite funny because when you look at the difference between the hundreds of private companies in the 19th century who were political entrepreneurs, who took on the government subsidies, in other words, the socialist government subsidies, all of those hundreds of private companies in the steamship industry, the railroad industry, they were all going bankrupt. Those who took on no government subsidies, such as James J. Hill or Cornelius Vanderbilt, they gave their competition a complete showing up.
Let's start with that word, efficient. What is efficiency?
So economic efficiency is all about how you achieve the maximum results whilst using the fewest resources possible. That is to say, how do you lift the masses of people out of poverty whilst using the fewest resources possible so that you can achieve the maximum results. If it costs you more to use more resources, you're going to use fewer resources in order to maximise your profits, and profits is information driven by the consumer. That's why capitalism is efficient.
The dictionary definition is effective operation as measured by a comparison of production with cost, as in energy, time, and money. The capitalist understanding of that definition is where we get into trouble. Capitalism is driven by the profit motive, the pursuit of ever greater financial gain regardless of actual economic performance.
The economic illiteracy of that comment is just unreal. Through the profit motive and the information of profits, profits is something that incentivizes businesses to seek the most efficient method of production. It means, how do you achieve, in relation to your business reputation, how do you achieve the maximum results? How do you achieve something that's going to serve the consumer, that the consumer will greatly benefit from, whilst minimising your costs? If it costs you more to use more resources, you're going to, of course, cut down on resource usage. So therefore, you're cutting down on waste in order to maximise the profits. So that's what we mean in terms of profits. Profits incentivises businesses to seek the most efficient method of production. What's the way in which they can cut their costs? What's the way in which they can cut the waste, etc.? All in relation to do with efficiency, and profits is information that will convey that.
With that vision in mind, efficiency can be defined as making the smallest possible investment or expending the least amount of energy or resources to ensure increasing profits and minimum acceptable function or quality.
When you've got losses, you've got the information telling you what to stop doing, what to stop producing, where to stop allocating resources, etc., etc. It incentivizes businesses to make change because businesses don't want to make losses. So if they are making losses, then of course they're incentivized to change. If you no longer hold the information of profits and losses, there is no longer that incentive to make such a change. Profits is information the consumer conveys to the market. Now, there is no benefit to companies to overproduce and create waste. The problem that you're faced with today is that you've got a style of economy where government is heavily interfering in the market and is incentivizing such waste. It's not being punished because you're living under corporatism. Whereas in a capitalist system, these type of companies who are wasteful are faced with punishment, because if you use more resources, it's costing you more. If you want to maximize your profits, how do you do that? Use fewer resources because it costs you more to use more resources. Common sense would tell you that, but second thought doesn't understand common sense.
First and foremost, there is a common misconception that capitalism is defined by markets.
Jeez, oh folk, I don't know how many times I've pointed this out before, and I'll show it again. A market economy is basically defining a capitalist system. Essentially, capitalism is an individualist system. They cannot for the life of them pull capitalism outside of individualism, folk. They cannot do it. No matter how much second thought likes to believe that he cannot remove capitalism from individualism, and the reason why he cannot do so is because collectivism is a word synonymous to the word socialism. Things down to a question of scale. Capitalism is present even within the mixed economy to some extent. Therefore, it's not a full-blown socialist economy, it's not some full-blown capitalist economy, it's a mixed economy. And under this type of style of economy, you have corporatism. The point is, however, capitalism is an individualist system, and it really is defined around the market economy, defined around a free market. That is to say, when you look at the definition of individualism, it defines a style of economy free from government interference, where the market's left be to regulate itself. Capitalism is the opposite of collectivism, therefore it's individualist. So capitalism's got nothing to do with what he is about to try and explain.
That is not the case. Take feudalism, for example. As a system that existed well before the birth of capitalism, it cannot be claimed that feudalism was capitalist. And yet feudalism had markets.
He thinks that just because mercantilism dominated the earth for several centuries long, and even throughout the British Industrial Revolution, he seems to think that things are black and white. But even to that extent, yes, capitalism's present within this mixed economy, but was capitalism responsible for why corporatism exists? No. It's just like how you had under feudalism the mercantilism, etc., and that's what existed, and yes, there were markets. But capitalism, on a question of scale, capitalism is about the market left be to regulate itself. Whereas under that feudal system, you pretty much had the communal ownership of agriculture. It was basically a centrally planned system where the aristocracy centrally planned how much was to be produced, what was to be produced, etc., etc. So essentially, what you saw was political centralization, a form of socialism, in other words, a collectivist system.
Serfs produced goods, which they handed over to their lords, and which those lords then sold in markets. Sometimes even the serfs had access to markets.
In other words, a top-down structural system where the central planner was getting to basically dictate what was getting produced, how much was getting produced, and the aristocracy got to dictate everything through mercantilism. Now again, it's all down to a question of scale. It's just like how if you use fascism today as an example, a type of socialism where they use an element of capitalism with the private sector, it's not true private ownership because it's using socialism for the state to completely control the private sector. And that's why it's not a capitalist system. In Nazi Germany, you saw the strong government regulation giving the state the power to completely collectively control the means of production. Well, it's no different to that time period. It's just like how you would see some level with that of a market to some extent, but who was it that gained the access? Of course, it was down to the feudal lords, as he's explaining, so again, it's down to a special privileged few. Well, of course, they had the use of socialism to create that structural system where it's centrally planned, political centralization, and the wealth all went up to the hands of the few.
Okay, but if capitalism isn't defined by markets, if markets existed long before capitalism, what does define it?
Well, that's completely false, because capitalism was defined around that of what used to be called meritocracy. Don't confuse meritocracy with that of mercantilism. The mercantilism that dominated the earth for several centuries to and during the British Industrial Revolution. It goes back to the days of the first days of barter when you're speaking about capitalism. Unfortunately, throughout human history, for millennia, we saw collectivism collectivism dominate the planet. And of course, it shows on the question of scale, the more capitalist it becomes on that question of scale, the better off your economy proves to be, and history's been very, very clear of that. Very clear.
I would say capitalism is defined by 3 core philosophies. First, the drive for short-term profits over long-term stability.
If you're incentivized to make profits, you're going to be concerned over that to do with the reputation of your business. He misses out the very fact that you don't live under a capitalist system. Of course, he doesn't mention about the subsidies, he tries to blame it on capitalism. It's the fact that you've got all this government interference, and he just pretends, oh well, it's something to do with capitalism. Utter nonsense.
Second, the rigid stratification of the owner class and the working class.
The rigid stratification, basically what he's talking about is a structural system and a hierarchy, basically. That's it, a hierarchical system. You know, the type that claims about capitalism leads to a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. When you move in the question of scale away from capitalism and you move further and further towards socialism, you're destroying the only ism with a middle class. That's capitalism. So if you destroy the middle class, how the hell do you expect people to move up the ladder? Well, they can't. What you end up with is a 1% elite, like your Nicolas Maduro, or of course your Fidel Castro, and you end up with people living like peasants. Now you contrast that between Cuba in Hong Kong, and you can see a massive difference historically between the two of them. One was efficient, the other was not. Guess which one was more capitalist and which one was more socialist? I shouldn't even need to tell you that.
And third, a devotion to imperialist expansion and infinite growth.
How the hell can you take a collectivist system that's a type of socialism called imperialism or colonialism and then pass that off as something to blame on capitalism when it's governments that are the cause for why imperialism exists? It's a government-controlled and directed system. It's government that directs everything through the use of socialism. So it's socialism that's to blame for the wars. You know, it's a bit like these people who run around claiming that they're anti-war. You know, the likes of your Noam Chomsky, etc. But in practice, collectivism always leads to a self-serving government. The true face of collectivism, you're always going to go down the road of serfdom. And that's essentially what you end up with. And eventually, because they're running out of other people's money, where are they going to get the money from? Invading other countries.
As socialists have correctly pointed out for well over a century, the tendencies of capitalism do not lend themselves to market efficiency.
So your socialism creates a problem. Through all your socialist government subsidies, it creates and incentivizes such waste in the private sector. You try to blame that on capitalism. Brilliant.
But rather towards military oppression of foreign populations, over-exploitation of workers and natural resources, and increasingly frequent economic crises.
Folk, these people just love to use the term exploitation and they just throw it around loosely. Just like the time they tried to claim that during the Industrial Revolution people were poorly mistreated and exploited. Given the fact that their wage growth was unprecedented, given the fact that their life expectancy more than doubled, population more than tripled, their living standards continuously improved, you saw a dramatic decrease of the work week hours. Entire life was improving, but somehow they drew to the logical conclusion with unprecedented wealth and wage growth that somehow this equaled exploitation. Again, it's really just a baseless claim that he's making.
Capitalism relies on the exploitation of workers at home and abroad.
And you're not living under a capitalist system. And if you want to see what exploitation looks like, just look at these socialist countries. Funny thing is, they always use the excuse and say, oh, it's all a US embargo that caused the mess. And even if they use that argument, what is stopping Cuba trading with any other country across the planet? Just because the United States imposes an embargo doesn't stop a country trading with other countries. Of course, that's where their argument falls flat in its arse. You see, these people love to talk about exploitation, but I cannot think of something more exploitative than what you see of countries like North Korea, where they get paid literally nothing and they have suicide nets, etc.
and this working class is entirely at the mercy of those who own the companies which put them to work.
How on earth are they at the mercy of those who employ them? First and foremost, they're not forced to work for the company and they can easily go away and start up their own private business. What the hell do you call those socialist economies then? See, if you never had private individual ownership, your only path is down the road of totalitarianism, because you've got no individual rights, no individual liberty, there's no individual ownership. So part of the individual ownership is personal ownership of possessions, so you're not going to have that. Therefore, there is no ability for the individual, no freedom for the individual to work for the fruits of their own labour. That's the true face of collectivism, the true face of socialism, and we know that from recorded history.
In reality, these workers are often more excluded from capitalist markets than even feudal serfs.
How the hell are people in a capitalist system get less access than that of people that live in a feudal system? And back in those days, the aristocracy owned 80% of the wealth. Now that was down to building and land ownership in that time period between 1650 and 1700. Most of the wealth was in the hands of the 2%, that being the aristocracy. And I think it was 10% wealth for that of the middle class and the working class. And under capitalism, you've seen the masses being lifted out of poverty and people have greater access to wealth and everything. You're just not making logical sense whatsoever.
Because the modern worker does not own any of the goods or services they produce.
They're not supposed to. The goods that are produced is owned by the company, and the company has no use for them if they're not going to sell. The goods are then produced and they're put on the shelves, giving access to the consumer, so the consumer is king. Now those workers who work for that company can be the consumer, so after they finish work they can easily have the freedom to buy the goods because they're on the shelves. So yes, they do have the ability to the fruits of their own labour because it's on the shelves. There's no use producing something if it's not going to sell. Why would a company produce something and just for the sake of keeping it? There's no point to that. There's no point to the business. Now, if that was down to your system of what I just explained with the communal ownership of property, you strip individuals of their ability to work for the fruits of their own labour. So essentially you're contradicting yourself, because without secure private property rights, what you saw in the real world was the starving time, and there was 104 pilgrim settlers that settled into Jamestown, despite the fact they had a large quantity of seafood surrounding them, deer and turkey to fetch for, as well of course fertile soil to grow their own food. Within a space of 6 months, only 38 of them had survived, as most of them had succumbed to famine. Now the very reason for why the starvation occurred was simply because of the absence of the ability for them to work for the fruits of their own labour. Because in practice, in the real world, not some theoretical world, the actual world of communal ownership of property, of what it actually means, of what it actually was, of why you faced the tragedy of the commons, they didn't have the ability to work for the fruits of their own labour, because everything that was to be produced was to be put into a communal pool. So there was no ability for the individual to own their own fruits of their labour.
It matters because if the workers are excluded from the market system, that means only a tiny minority of wealthy and powerful people, the owner class, has access to the so-called free market.
Again, folk, I have pointed this out before and I'll point it out again, and what you can see is that from what Thomas J. DiLorenzo points out in his book, How Capitalism Saved America, this was during a time period of the myth of the robber barons, during a time period where apparently there was a dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few, the 70% going to that of the workers, and the capital and resource suppliers had 30% of the wealth, and that remained the same throughout that entire 60-year time period. So it contradicts the narrative about this dangerous concentration of wealth in the hands of the few. He's basically trying to argue that because they owned the means of production, that somehow this means they dominate the market and everything like that. But of course he ignores the fact that in order for businesses to even make profits in the first place, it's the consumer that drives the production. After all, what worth is it producing something hoping for the best when you've no guarantee that it's going to sell?
But the selling of products on the market is only half the equation. The other half is production. Similar to the sale of products by the owner class, the production of those products is also controlled by the wealthy and powerful. Those who own the means of production, a factory, a pharmaceutical lab, a supermarket chain, decide what is produced, how it is produced, when it is produced, and so on.
Wrong. It's not down to the business owners to decide for that. It's down to the consumer, whether the consumer is willing to pay for something or not. If that was the case, you would have no requirement for market research departments. You wouldn't need a market research department. In fact, they could simply get rid of the market research department and they would make more money because they're paying out less in wages. Why then do businesses have market research departments? That is to say that market research departments exist to find out what consumers' needs and wants are. Now that's the issue. It is the consumer who is determining what gets produced and what doesn't, and consumer demand fluctuates and changes all the time. So if you're not going to listen to your consumers, then there's nothing sensible about that, because you end up facing the risk that you're going to face losses and use more resources than what's required. So you're less efficient. Now again, like I've explained before with regards to inefficiency, there's issues with that of government's interference with government regulation, etc., that hinders businesses and ends up incentivizing such waste.
Doesn't the free market still determine the final price and dictate how and what companies produce?
Of course it does, because it's down to the consumer of what they're willing to pay for something. Businesses can't just set whatever price they like, whatever price at £10,000, and somehow this guarantees that it'll sell. If consumers are not going to pay for such a good at such a price, then that's it. It's going to be left there on the shelves, because the reality is a consumer is only going to part with their money if the value is greater than the cost. If the cost of such a good is greater than the value for what they're getting, the consumer is not going to part with their money.
Misguided defenders of capitalism will say, of course, the market is beholden to the law of supply and demand. Companies have to produce what the market demands, or they won't make a profit.
That is, of course, if you're talking about this to do with a capitalist system. But this is where he leaves it out, because you're living under this mixed economy, you're living under corporatism, and therefore you live under a type of system where you see a lot of private sector waste, and it's been incentivized because of government's interference. He left that out. He wants to pretend to you that somehow this system you see today is capitalism, and it's not.
This belief in a supposed economic law is not reflected in reality. Like everything else under capitalism, supply and demand is manipulated by those with money and power.
This is where he's going to go on and use the example destroying such goods, and of course it's down to this of government's interference. This is where he tries to blame the market.
Let's look at one recent example.
This is one of Amazon's biggest UK warehouses in Dunfermline, Scotland. And from inside where millions of perfectly good products each year are sent to be destroyed. Secret footage captured in what's known as the destruction zone, and that calls into question the company's environmental and ethical practices. An ITV News investigation reveals unsold laptops scanned not for delivery, but instead marked destroyed.
But the issue being is the fact that these companies are burdened down by such government regulation and government's interference that's creating such a problem. We've seen a prime example of this with regards to food waste, of course. Government regulation has forced businesses into such a position. In other words, they're incentivized to just dump the waste. Now that's just a prime example of exactly what I mean. Them creating a problem through government's interference, through regulation, and then they project the blame off onto the private sector. How the hell did they manage that mental gymnastics when the private sector is not left be to regulate itself? So some of you might remember a trend that was going around blaming capitalism during the pandemic, saying that capitalism was producing such waste, and it was this trend claiming that it's these retail companies just dumping perfectly good clothing, etc., how the buttons, etc., could all be donated. Of course, all charity is capitalism. They ignore this fact, but this was the trend that was going around. Of course, blaming capitalism, and many people were tweeting all these things, and they didn't even bother to look into things. So, in this article, it states, it has become fashionable to blame capitalism for bad behaviour and corruption as of late, at least among some demographics, but dig beneath the surface for even 5 minutes and you will typically find that the source of the problem is actually government regulation. It says such is largely the case with the companies destroying their products instead of choosing to donate them, especially when it comes to food. As it states, a mix of federal, state and local laws, wrote Harvard law professor Jacob Gerson in a 2016 article for Time. make it almost impossible to get food that would otherwise be wasted to those who could use it. If you donated food to someone and they get sick or even die, then you could be legally liable for their injury. That risk, however small, means that when choosing between giving away and throwing away food, the least risky choice is to toss it. Some lawmakers have recognised this problem and passed provisions that limit the liability companies face, but only if they go through a third-party charitable organisation first. That makes the donation process costly and time-consuming for busy business owners. So the point is, folk, is the very fact that this is a problem of government's interference. Because if this was down to the free market, the companies would be able to afford, they would be able to give away charitably, and they wouldn't be faced with this problem. So again, it's the absence of the free market. It's the absence of capitalism. This is essentially what you're faced with, all because of government and its lawmakers, etc., that's basically incentivized these businesses just to toss it rather than giving away. And you've got to remember, when it comes down to that of electrical goods, what if those electrical goods that they give away end up catching fire, someone's house, goes up in flames, they end up losing their life, the company's held liable. This is exactly what we mean. So the company is obviously just going to toss the goods, such as Amazon for example, because it's safer for them to do so, simply because they're going to be held liable if someone's affected by it. That's why they just destroy it.
What's going on here? Why are these items being destroyed? The answer is simple. It makes Amazon more money to dump perfectly good laptops, TVs, and silverware into a landfill as opposed to selling it at a loss or donating it to charity.
If it costs you more to use more resources, it's less profitable. It is not the case that a company somehow reaps greater profits from being wasteful. That's why Rockefeller was so successful as he was.
Too much product availability drives prices down, and it's more profitable to keep demand high by artificially limiting product availability.
They're not living under a capitalist system. In other words, if you were forced to live under a capitalist system and let's say you outlawed all government subsidies, so they're forced to pay for their own losses, and you got rid of all the government regulation, and those businesses were forced into a position where there's no barrier to entry into the market and there's fierce competition stepping in, that competition is going to force them to continue on driving down their costs. They wouldn't have the opportunity to restrict productive output, and that's the very reason why you saw Rockefeller continuing to drive down his costs. It was actually through the interference of government that enabled businesses to then get away with restricting productive output. That was done through the antitrust law legislation, the so-called legislation that was used to try and break up supposed monopolies. I say supposed because apparently they created monopolies but they never. So this is the issue. Government's interference ended up giving rise to oligopolies, monopolies, cartels, so it just isn't the case. You don't get away with restricting productive output in a fiercely competitive free market economy. You've got that problem today because of the corporatist system, because of government's interference that has enabled it to happen.
To further hammer home the dystopian nature of our for-profit system, during the pandemic, we saw armed guards blocking people from retrieving food from dumpsters outside grocery stores.
Again, folk is really just economically illiterate. He's going on about efficiency, but then he says the for-profit system. Again, that term in a negative context. See, if you get rid of profits, how then do you know that consumers' needs and wants? With hundreds and millions of different products out there on the market, thousands of these different industries, etc., how the hell do you know how much to produce, what to produce, where to allocate resources, etc. if you've not got the information of profits and losses? Well, that's it, you don't hold the information. Again, it's really just a case that these people don't even understand what prices are.
The US is not the only country at fault here. Other capitalist nations act similarly.
Well, they're not capitalist nations, they're living under corporatism. Singapore is far more capitalist than what we are. We're living under a strong mixed economy, and unfortunately we are so far removed from our free market, it's unreal.
We produce enough food to feed every human on Earth, with plenty to spare. But the inherent traits of capitalism disincentivize a common sense allocation of resources in favor of maximizing profit.
Again, the stupidity of that argument is the fact that if you're going to eliminate the information of profits and losses, you no longer hold the information during time preference of what's in greater demand over what. Now, the very reason for why the market knows at what specific given time during the year, for whatever reason being, how they know how much milk to allocate to what given products that milk is used for producing, such as ice cream, yogurt, cheese, butter. The only reason why the market knows how much of the milk resource to use to allocate to what is price fluctuation. So if the price drives up all of a sudden, that's the market signifying here is where there's a greater demand at this specific given time during the year. If you eliminate information of profits and losses, how the hell then do you know where to allocate the milk as a resource? After all, you've got hundreds of different types of butter. So how then do you know how much of the milk to allocate and where and when? You don't. You don't hold the information of profits and losses. So it's a contradiction. How the hell can you argue in your entire video on efficiency, but then say as a contradiction, profits is something standing in your way? That's economically illiterate. If you don't hold the information of profits, you don't hold the information of consumers' needs and wants. End of story.
These tendencies, the tendencies to cut corners, generate tons of waste, and neglect long-term stability, exist in every sector. We've recently seen the consequences of supposed capitalist efficiency in my home state of Texas and in Florida. During last winter's cold snap, millions of Texans were left without power or clean drinking water.
Folk, go check out my video on Jimmy Dore, which is laughable to say the least because I had touched upon this and I addressed it. In other words, they weren't able to up the energy use, all in the name of government legislation for climate change. So because of their climate change policy and government's interference, it actually created the very problem.
Many for days or even weeks on end. This was the direct result of the reckless privatization of our electrical grid.
So there you go. It's nothing at all to do with some privatised, grid or something, whatever he's talking about. This reminds me of the same story where they tried to claim that the privatisation and deregulation of the power grid in New York caused the blackout in 2003, August 24th. That's not what created the power shortage in 2003. It was actually down to a price ceiling. But it's classic of socialists to do this every single time. They create a problem and then they project the blame off elsewhere. Yet again, a fine example again, government creating a problem and then projecting the blame off onto the market.
On June 24th, Champlain Towers South, a condo building in Surfside, collapsed, killing an as yet undetermined number of people, likely over 100. For years, the developers had known about critical flaws in the integrity of the building, which would have cost them an estimated $9 million to rectify.
So again, here we have another example of a disaster through that of government interference. The government has made it less profitable, therefore you're faced with that very problem, and of course people sadly lost their life.
Capitalism's vision of efficiency is predicated not on ensuring the long-term function or sustainability of our systems, or the common sense allocation of resources, labor, or products, but on minimizing costs and maximizing profits.
Does he not hear the contradiction in his statement now? If they're going to minimize their costs, they're going to use fewer resources and they're going to maximize their profits by doing so. That's how you maximize your profits, by being more efficient. He can't even hear his own contradiction. That really is funny.
Efficiency is just a euphemism for cost-cutting, destructive, wasteful practices.
The only way that you're going to cut your costs is by being more efficient, of course. It means being less wasteful, it means being more efficient. So again, it's a logical contradiction.
It removes the human factor from the equation and centers capital instead.
How does it remove the human factor from the equation if it's the human factor that drives what the profits are? The consumer's needs and wants is conveying to the market, here's what we want, here's what we don't want. That's what profits and losses are. Profits is a price signal to tell you what consumers' needs and wants are. It's a contradiction. For you to oppose profits is for you to oppose consumers' needs and wants. Effectively, you're going to go down the road of what every socialist economy does and ending up with the very problems that you see with the surplus waste and shortage problems like you saw of the Soviet Union.
Nothing this country does is efficient in any real sense. It's wasteful, short-sighted, and inhumane.
Well, that's actually because of the fact of what I've explained through all the government's interference and the absence of the capitalist system.
So no, capitalism is not the most efficient system. It doesn't deserve to be called efficient at all. People are slowly coming around to that fact.
If people honestly think that they are living under a capitalist system, in other words, living under the type of system where you have free market money, interest rates set by the laws of supply and demand, the ratio of money set by the laws of supply and demand, and if they're honestly trying to say that they live in a private sector that has a market regulating itself, they're having a laugh. They're living under a mixed economy. Anybody who claims that they live under a capitalist system are very, very poorly misinformed and don't understand the first thing about economics. If you were living under a capitalist system, you would not have faced the banking crisis. And the reason why you would not have faced the banking crisis is because capitalism wouldn't fix your interest rates. Therefore, you wouldn't face the boom and bust cycle. If you were living under a capitalist system, you would not have seen the subsidised banks, forcing society into a collective group to subsidise the losses of others through the use of socialism is anti-capitalism, so it's just dishonesty on your behalf.
I mentioned climate change a number of times in this video. It's a prime example of capitalism's short-sightedness, and how we fail to take into account enormous consequences even a handful of years in the future.
So I really don't need to go into the whole argument on the climate change, as I've touched upon this before, and it goes into a whole argument on its own. However, geologists agree that temperature drives CO2, and it's not CO2 that drives the temperature. Even 500,000 years ago, you saw the CO2 levels more than twice as high as they are today, yet despite that very fact, you never saw the extinction as they claim to be. And he talks about this to do with the water levels rising, just utter nonsense, folk. Again, I don't need to go into too much on that information. However, what's his solution? Well, his solution is going to go down the road of the argument on socialism, which is destructive. Nothing's been more destructive on the planet and the resources than that of socialism. Now, I'm not saying we shouldn't look after the environment, of course we should. But the difference between capitalism and socialism is, when government creates a problem, it doesn't pay for its own losses and it's got no incentive to do so anyway. But with capitalism, you've got profits and losses, and you've got the reality that land can either appreciate or depreciate in value, and there's no incentive for a private landowner to depreciate the value of their property. So they're going to appreciate the value of their property. That means using fewer resources, and even if they do cut down trees, etc, they're going to regrow the trees. When you eliminate all of that and you go down the road of what you saw of like the likes of the Soviet Union, just look at the Aral Sea, of how it devastated once the fourth largest lake in the world. It ended up becoming well, let's just say it was devastated by 1960. Devastated the local fishing industry between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. You know, the land was left contaminated. Again, you could even use the examples and contrast between BP that caused an oil spill. That company was over-regulated anyway. But the point being, you contrast that to the spill in the Gulf of Mexico by the state-owned Mexican oil company. How convenient. The state didn't even pay for its own damages. I hope you've enjoyed the video. If you've got anything you would like to ask, comment in the comments section below. If you've got anything you would like to, add in, just comment. And of course, thank you for watching. Be sure to like the video, share the video, and of course, I'll talk to you later. Cheers.